Imagine an economy where, like, an empty wooden box makes more money in a year than the highly educated engineer living inside it.
Right, which sounds like some kind of thought experiment or a hypothetical scenario.
Yeah. But it's not. For the last 2 decades, that has essentially been the Canadian economy.
It is a profound structural shift. I
Yeah.
mean, we are looking at a system where an entire country's economic identity has essentially been consumed by a single asset class.
Exactly. And welcome to today's deep dive.
Yeah.
Because our mission today is to take a really massive stack of research. We're looking at federal housing data from the CMHC.
That's a Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation.
Right, thank you. And we're also looking at nonprofit blueprints from a group called Generation Squeeze, economic data from the Hub, and even some ground-level cultural commentary from YouTube.
Yeah, it's a lot of material to unpack.
It is. But we're using all of it to understand this massive identity crisis happening right now.
Yeah.
Because Canada's housing market hasn't just been a place to live. It has, become the entire economy.
And our goal today isn't just to gawk at the sticker shock of expensive homes. We are really breaking down the mechanisms here. Like, how did a diversified, resilient economy become a monoculture?
Right.
What are the cascading effects when residential real estate just starves every other sector? And most importantly, what are the highly unconventional solutions emerging from all this fallout?
Because whether you're trying to rent your first apartment or secure funding for a tech startup, or you're just wondering why the hiring practices at your local coffee shop have completely changed recently, this structural shift dictates your reality.
It really touches everything.
It does. So let's start with the sheer scale of the bubble, because the numbers in the CMHC and the historical data are just staggering. From 2002 to 2022, Canadian real estate saw price increases of up to 337% in some major cities.
Wow.
Right. And by 2023, real estate accounted for over 20% of Canada's entire gross domestic product.
And to put that 20% figure in perspective, it vastly outpaces the real estate footprint of almost every other advanced economy. It is just an enormous concentration of capital.
Yeah, but the more fascinating question for me is, how did the system allow the bubble to inflate that much without anyone hitting the emergency brakes?
Well, the research from Generation Squeeze points to a really fundamental systemic flaw in how the country measured its own reality. They argue that the official national inflation measures severely undercounted rising home prices.
Wait, if the inflation index is supposed to be the central gauge for the cost of living, how does it just miss the single largest expense a human being has?
I know, it sounds crazy. But it comes down to how the basket of goods used to calculate inflation is actually constructed.
Okay.
Generation Squeeze's data suggests that the index heavily weighted the day-to-day carrying costs of a home, so things like mortgage interest and upkeep, rather than the skyrocketing asset value of the physical home itself.
Oh, I see. So while the sticker price of a house was doubling or tripling, the official inflation thermometer basically read as a relatively mild fever.
Exactly. And because the thermometer looked fine on paper, the doctor just kept prescribing more cheap money. The central bank looked at this tame inflation data and decided, hey, we can keep interest rates artificially low for a very, very long time.
Which triggers that massive cheap credit loop.
Right. It's a behavioral cycle. When a buyer can borrow $500,000 at practically 0% interest, they had a lot more firepower to bid on a house.
Yeah, and that bidding pushes the price up.
But because that massive price spike isn't fully captured in the inflation data, the central bank thinks everything is totally fine. So rates stay low, the next buyer borrows even more, and the loop just keeps spinning.
But, this brings up the most common dinner table argument you hear about the housing crisis.
Yeah.
Everyone always says, oh, it's just a supply problem. We have a growing population. We didn't build enough houses. Case closed.
Right, that's the standard narrative.
But the CMHC data completely shatters that narrative.
It really does. The historical completion data is honestly one of the most surprising elements in the entire stack of sources we looked at.
It blew my mind.
Yeah.
For almost 2 decades, from 2001 to 2022, housing completions actually exceeded new household formations in 19 of those 22 years.
Which is huge.
Yeah, meaning year after year, the country actually built more physical homes than there were new families to fill them. So the obvious question is, if the homes were being built, where did they all go?
Well, they were absorbed by investors. The data shows that up to 1 in 5 properties across much of the country are owned by investors who are just hoarding the new stock.
Unbelievable.
And in specific dense markets, it's far more extreme. Like A staggering 41% of all condos in Ontario are investor-owned.
Almost half.
Yeah. And if you think about it, if you are an investor with access to that cheap credit loop we just talked about, and housing is acting as the only asset class mathematically guaranteed to skyrocket.
The rational economic move is to just buy as much of it as you possibly can.
Ex-
It's basically like an economic black hole. It has such a strong gravitational pull that it just absorbs all the available domestic capital. And that starves productive sectors like, tech, manufacturing, innovation of the oxygen they need to grow.
Precisely.
Like, why would anyone risk investing in a volatile new tech startup when they can just buy a condo, do absolutely nothing, and watch it double in value?
And that starvation effect is really the invisible cost of a housing bubble. When you trap your country's wealth inside drywall and mortgages, you aren't investing in the machinery or software or business expansion that actually drives a nation's productivity forward.
Right, so if all the country's available capital is trapped in this black hole, that creates a massive starvation event for productive businesses.
Yeah.
And when businesses can't get capital to grow, they can't pay competitive wages or fund research.
Which leaves the people who work for them with a very simple, brutal choice.
Which leads directly to the talent exodus.
Yeah.
The data we reviewed from the Hub provides a really sobering look at this human capital flight. The top 1% of Canadian earners are increasingly migrating south to the United States.
And they're taking a massive chunk of the top 10% with them.
Yeah, and it's not just the top-tier employees leaving, it's the whole ecosystem of job creators. The startup metrics in the Hub were just staggering. In 2015, the U.S. was already producing about 11 times more high-potential startups than Canada.
Right.
But by 2024, that gap hadn't just widened, it exploded. The U.S. is now producing 45 times more high-potential startups. That is an entire generation of innovation just packing up and leaving.
And the mechanism driving this is incredibly straightforward. High-skilled workers and ambitious entrepreneurs look at the domestic landscape and realize the capital they need to seed a company is locked up in residential real estate.
It's all in the drywall.
Exactly. Combine that lack of domestic venture capital with the modern normalization of remote work and historically high marginal tax rates. And the friction required to leave the country is just lower than it has ever been in modern history.
I do struggle with the U.S. migration argument, though, just a little bit. We
Yeah.
constantly hear about the insane cost of living in American economic hubs like Silicon Valley, Austin, New York.
Sure.
The math of uprooting your whole life just to pay astronomical U.S. rent doesn't immediately make sense for a young professional.
Well, it makes sense when you factor in the sheer scale of the wage premium in the U.S. for highly skilled, high IQ workers. The American economy remains uniquely productive and deeply capitalized.
Okay.
And that creates fierce, well-funded competition for top talent, which bids up salaries to levels that starved domestic businesses simply cannot match.
Right, because domestic businesses don't have the venture capital.
Exactly. So even with the higher living costs in those American tech hubs, the massive jump in earning potential and the access to deep pools of venture capital far outweigh the localized costs for these top earners.
And this structural economic starvation is creating a very strange, very palpable cultural vibe back home. We spent some time reviewing commentary from Spencer Gatman.
Oh yeah, the YouTube creator.
Right, he covers the economic sentiment, and he does a great job articulating this. He describes a pervasive crabs-in-a-bucket mentality settling over young Canadians.
Yeah, it's a bleak analogy, but very fitting.
There's this growing collective feeling that ambition is almost discouraged, or at the very least, structurally penalized by a system that only rewards property ownership.
And that cultural frustration isn't just a feeling, you know. It has a clear mechanical cause when you look at the entry-level job market. Gatton highlights how beloved cultural staples institutions like Tim Hortons have fundamentally shifted their operational models.
Right.
And that heavily alienates their local customer and labor base.
Yeah, because historically, those were the places where local teenagers and young adults got their vital first jobs. It was the first rung on the ladder. You build a basic resume, you learn to show up on time, and you use that momentum to enter the broader economy.
Right.
But recently, these franchises have shifted to a heavy reliance on temporary foreign workers to fill those roles instead of hiring local youth.
And the mechanism here is crucial. When structural labor policies incentivize the use of temporary foreign workers for entry-level roles, Those vital first rungs of the economic ladder are just removed for local youth.
And youth unemployment spikes.
Exactly. Young people are prevented from building the initial capital and work experience they need, effectively trapping them in bottom. That is what generates the crabs in a bucket mentality. They are locked out of the housing market and simultaneously locked out of the entry-level labor market.
And our goal here isn't to take political sides, just to be clear. We are just looking at the systemic economic critiques. But we do need to look at how the government attempts to manage the optics of this.
Right, the macroeconomic response.
Yeah, the critique detailed in our sources points out that to paper over this glaring lack of real private sector productivity and high youth unemployment, the government resorts to massive deficit-funded make-work projects. They cite the proposed $90 billion high-speed rail line as a prime example.
The structural critique of those projects is that they function primarily to inject borrowed money into the system to keep the national GDP numbers technically positive.
So they simulate growth.
Exactly. They simulate it, but they don't solve the underlying productivity crisis or the lack of private business investment.
It creates a dangerous cycle.
It creates what economists call a fiscal squeeze. The state spends heavily to subsidize the public university education of these brilliant young minds. But because the private sector is starved of capital, those minds migrate to the U.S. during their peak, most lucrative tax-paying years.
So the state loses the return on its educational investment.
Yeah, and the domestic tax base shrinks exactly when it is desperately needed to fund healthcare and public services for an aging population.
So if you're a local, you are squeezed out of the entry-level job market, priced out of ever owning a home, and you're watching the top talent in your city move to Texas. Frustrated locals naturally look for a target.
People want someone to blame.
Public anger demands a boogeyman. And the loudest public narratives almost always point the finger at the big players buying up the housing stock foreign money and real estate investment trusts, or REITs.
And to be clear, the research confirms that bad actors absolutely exist and cause severe localized damage. The Cullen Commission in British Columbia is the prime example.
Oh, the Vancouver model.
Right. It thoroughly documented this incredible system where organized crime laundered an estimated $5.3 billion of fentanyl and illicit drug money through provincial casinos and directly into the local real estate market in a single year.
That is just wild.
It is. And that influx of billions in dirty money undeniably inflated regional property prices artificially.
But then you look at the fully legal institutional side of the spectrum, the REITs, the pension funds and corporate landlords. And the data we pulled on them reveals a reality that completely defies the standard public narrative of pure corporate greed.
This CMHC conducted a highly detailed study on the Montreal market, specifically comparing apartment buildings owned by REITs to those owned by everyday non-REIT landlords. Right.
And at first glance, the data seemed to confirm everyone's worst fears. The raw numbers showed that REITs charged a 25% premium on rent.
Case closed, right. The massive corporation is gouging the tenant for 25% more.
But when the CMHC researchers controlled the data for geography and operational differences, that entire 25% premium completely vanished.
Wait, if the 25% premium vanishes just by controlling for operations, that means the base rent of the physical space isn't actually higher. They must be bundling something massive into the baseline cost, utilities.
That is exactly the mechanism. The study revealed that 82% of the REIT-owned buildings included utilities, heat, electricity, hot water directly in the base rent.
Oh, wow.
Compare that to the non-REIT landlords, where only 20% included utilities. Once you mathematically extract the cost of keeping the lights and heat on, the actual rent for the space is statistically identical.
Okay, but what about the geography factor? People always accuse institutional investors of swooping into affordable neighborhoods, buying up the block, and causing massive gentrification that prices everyone out. The data suggests we have the causality backwards there. REITs act much more like stock market speculators. They don't necessarily possess the power to cause widespread gentrification on their own.
Really?
What they do possess are incredibly sophisticated data models. They are highly adept at identifying pre-gentrified areas that are naturally going to appreciate due to shifting city demographics or new transit lines. They simply buy the buildings before the prices spike.
So, thinking REITs cause gentrification is like blaming an umbrella for causing the rain. They didn't make it rain, they just checked the Doppler radar, saw the storm coming, and got there first.
Precisely. The higher average rents associated with their buildings aren't because they are artificially gouging tenants for the exact same product. It's because they strategically own the specific apartments that have the heating bill rolled in, and those apartments happen to sit in up-and-coming neighborhoods that naturally appreciate in market value.
So if I'm a renter, the massive institutional REIT isn't the cartoon villain the internet told me it was.
Not according to the data.
But even if we clear the institutional investors of being the primary villains, the physical math of the Canadian housing market remains absolutely brutal. Regardless of who owns the deed, the sources universally agree that navigating out of this crisis requires physical and structural solutions on a scale we haven't seen since the post-war era.
Yeah, the sheer scale of the physical deficit is daunting. The CMHC calculates that just to return to the housing affordability levels that Canada enjoyed back in 2004, the country needs to build 3.5 million additional units by the year 2030.
3.5 million additional.
Yes, above and beyond the baseline of what is already scheduled to be built. And if the current high levels of population growth continue, they project that gap will jump to 4 million extra units.
4 million extra homes in a matter of years. That is a mountain to climb.
It really is.
Which brings us to the actual blueprints for how to fix this. Generation Squeeze proposes a fundamental psychological mindset shift for the entire country. They argue that the core sickness is treating housing as a wealth builder. They propose that we actually need to let home prices stall out entirely. Let the market flatline for years, allowing local wages the time they desperately need to catch up to the cost of living. They even go as far as proposing a modest surtax on homes valued over $1 million to actively slow the speculative market down.
It is an incredibly bitter pill for the current generation of homeowners to swallow, but it is structurally necessary if the ultimate goal is returning to affordability. You cannot have homes be both universally affordable and constantly doubling in value as an investment vehicle.
It's mathematically impossible.
Exactly. But beyond the financial ideology, there is the grueling physical reality of how you actually build 3.5 million homes in the country suffering from a massive shortage of construction labor.
Which is where the blueprint from Anhart Community Housing comes in. This was genuinely one of the most fascinating and hopeful parts of our deep dive.
Definitely.
Anhart provides a working model for how we can physically build our way out of this using modular housing. And to be clear, we are not talking about slapping together cheap temporary trailers here. We are talking about highly advanced, permanent structures that slash project delivery times by 50 to 60%.
And the key to modular housing is that it fundamentally changes the logistics and labor dynamic of construction. Instead of struggling to find enough specialized tradespeople to work outdoors on muddy, weather-dependent construction sites,
Which takes forever.
exactly, up to 90% of the building is precision engineered inside massive, climate-controlled factories.
It's essentially parallel processing for real estate. It's like building an entire apartment complex out of giant high-tech Lego blocks inside a warehouse.
That's a great way to put it.
And because it's a controlled manufacturing environment, it provides stable, year-round indoor employment, which is far more attractive to the modern workforce. Plus, the precision engineering means these modules can easily meet incredibly strict net zero energy standards right off the assembly line.
But the physical factory is really only half the equation here. The real secret sauce of the Anhart model is their financial structure. Because the biggest hurdle to affordable housing isn't just wood and steel, it's the cost of capital and bureaucracy.
Right, because Anhart partners directly with nonprofits rather than traditional for-profit developers.
And that changes the entire math of the project. When a modular development is driven by a nonprofit, it bypasses the traditional developer red tape.
Which is huge.
Oh, it's massive. This nonprofit status allows them to unlock federal Build Canada Homes low-interest loans. They can often negotiate to dodge heavy municipal development fees that cripple normal projects. And most importantly, they utilize what the industry calls patient capital.
Meaning investors who aren't demanding a massive immediate payout.
Exactly. Traditional developers need high-interest financing, and they demand massive profit margins within a really short window, like 3 years. Patient capital involves investors, often institutional or impact investors, who are willing to accept lower, highly stable returns spread out over 15 to 20 years.
So they're in it for the long haul.
Right. And when you combine cheap federal loans, no municipal fees, and patient capital with the 50% faster build time of a modular factory, the math actually works. You can build high-quality housing and keep the rents permanently affordable.
It proves that we don't need a miracle to solve this. The capital exists in the system. The physical technology exists in these modular factories. It just requires rewiring the incentives so that money flows into productive, parallel processed housing solutions rather than just speculative hoarding.
It is entirely a question of structural alignment.
So what does this massive structural shift mean for you listening right now? We've covered a tremendous amount of ground today, but every single piece connects.
It really does.
The reason the local coffee shop relies on a different labor pool, the reason the brilliant tech startup you follow just packed up and relocated to Texas, and the reason factories are churning out modular high-tech apartments, they are all symptoms of the exact same core issue. An economic black hole where a housing market ate an entire country's economy.
And that black hole dictates your reality. It dictates where you can afford to live, the quality and wage potential of the jobs available in your city, and the very tax base that supports your communities, schools, and hospitals.
It's the ultimate lesson in what happens when an economy allows one single organism to grow so large, it chokes out the rest of the ecosystem.
Truly.
But as we look at the very real solutions we've unpacked today, like Generation Squeeze's push to stall home prices so wages can breathe, or Anhart's rapid parallel process modular factories, I want to leave you with a final paradox to chew on.
Because if these solutions are implemented, they create a whole new set of massive structural questions.
They absolutely do. Because if these models actually work, if we manage to deploy patient capital, build millions of modular homes, and deliberately force Canadian home values to flatline for the next decade to let wages catch up, what happens to the millions of everyday citizens whose entire life savings and retirement plan are based on the unwavering assumption that their house will forever double in value?
Will successfully solving the housing crisis accidentally trigger a massive retirement crisis?
Just something to think about.